We'll be looking at how to utilize Dataverse virtual table connections to connect with external data sources instead of creating the table within the Dataverse. This feature has been there for a while, but there's quite a lot of improvements in the recent past. In this demo, we'll see how we could connect to a virtual table, SQL as an example, and create an Power App and make an update using the Power App and see how the data flows between SQL to Power Apps and from Power Apps to SQL. We will also take a look at how to build that connector between the SQL database and also see how we could create a lookup column using that connection into the virtual table, which would be on SQL. Now, you could use SharePoint list as a virtual table. You could use Salesforce, ServiceNow, and other third party solutions as long as you have the connections in place. So let's head over to the Power Platform and see how it works together. I'm on the homepage, make.powerapps.com. And if you come here to tables, you could create a virtual table by clicking on this one. But what I found out was doing this way really doesn't create a virtual table. It only points me to a SharePoint list site. And after I select the SharePoint list, the table gets created with the data that's in the SharePoint list. Now that's a SharePoint list. Now that's a normal way that we usually did in the past while creating a Canvas app using a SharePoint list or creating a Dataverse table using the SharePoint list. But I did not see this one working as it should as a virtual table. I do have a table called retail in SharePoint. And if I click on this one, it would list all those rows and it would create a table in Dataverse. But it's not a virtual table by definition. So I would let you guys try it in your environment and see if that's the case. Now I could create this table and move on, but it's not a virtual table. Rather, what we can do here is create a solution, and within the solution, we could go ahead and access the virtual table creation in a different way. For example, if you right click on this table, there is nothing much to do. What we could do here is we move on to the solutions and create a new solution. Let's say virtual table example. I'll use the CDS as the publisher and I'll just create. It's a very blank vanilla solution package. I believe the reason is because you would need to have strict boundaries with pipeline and ALM. So that's probably one reason why you could only create those virtual table underneath the solution. So here it's all empty. We just created this solution package. And if I click on this table here, and if I click on new table and table, here I have this option from table from external data. So there's a big difference between the one that I shared before, where on the homepage you create a virtual table connect that only connects to the SharePoint list. But in here, you would have the connections coming in through. Now, we could create through SharePoint connections, a virtual table or a SQL server. I have a few connections in here, but we would also try to connect the SQL server connections one more time. And of course, you could bring in other third-party databases in here as well. Microsoft Fabric would open a whole lot of potential with one lake and a lot of data coming from Fabric, and this could really be a game changer as well. So we'll use the out-of-the-box SQL Server connector. Click on Next. While I create a new connection, it's going to open the connections. This is going to start asking me for the SQL Server connections. I'll do a quick refresh here. I do have here is an SQL authentication. I'll tell you where it is used. You could either use SQL Server authentication or Microsoft Entra authentication. I'm using SQL Server authentication. I do have a SQL database with the name AWS Retail and then SQL Server with the same name. And that table has a bit of record about order management or customers order detail. If you can see here, It's about the customer name, product, and stuff like that. So this is the database, and this is the table that's available within the SQL server. So you need to grab the SQL server name, and you got to grab the full server name for it to work. If I just use as AWS Retail DB, it doesn't work and it would throw error. And this is where you would use that authentication type. Remember, if you have created your SQL Server instance with one of these authentication type, you should choose that. In my case, I've chosen SQL Server authentication. I'm going to use that. And here I would give the full name of the SQL Server, and the database would be AWS Retail DB. I'd use the password that's saved in my system. And this is an online instance, and so we do not have to create a gateway. So we just need to use the connection strings, and then it gets connected. This is the one that just got connected, and of course I do have a few other connections with the same SQL Server connection string. Now, if I go back to the virtual table, I just do a refresh. You should see one more connection here. It's all the same. I just wanted to show with how this one works. And then I click next. So it's going to point to this table, which we saw in the Azure SQL instance. And we select that and click on next. And it takes time to do the column entity mapping. And if you notice, the primary column is grayed out, meaning you cannot change those. For example, order number here, which is another primary key, and likewise the customer name. You could change the name of the table here. So we will say virtual SQL table. So we would know which table that we're calling. Is it a virtual table or is it the actual SQL table? This would tell you the connections and the database that I'm bringing in to Dataverse as a virtual table. And this is the table name, and the schemas and primary column is customer name. And then we click on finish. Once everything is ready, the table would be created here in the solution package. When we created the solution, we had 0 tables. I created an app which connects to the Azure SQL table. It's easy for us to showcase the data edits both ways while this is creating, and this is just got over. So we do have the virtual table in here. And if I click on edit, it should list the data that is from the Azure SQL table. So these are all the data that is in Azure SQL. Let's have a look at the Azure table here. So this is the one that we just connected. This is an online SQL server. And we do have this data out here as well. I do have an app which connects to that SQL table. It's just a simple Power App. I'm using that connection in here. This is not to showcase, how the data could be brought into the Power Canvas app, as well as when we do the edit and see real time how the data is sent back to the SQL table as an edit. I will do a quick refresh with the connection just in case if we wanted to load the latest data. And if I apply that one, it's going to bring in the list of data that's from Azure SQL Server. While this is loading, what we could do some edits from the SQL side and refresh this in Power Platform and see if it works. For example, let's pick Bob Brown and make some edit in the Azure SQL. And this is Bob Brown here. So what I will do is edit that row. I will make it Bob Brown Senior and Richard. Instead of monitor, I'll change the name to tablet. Then I click on save. A quick refresh. So this table is now updated on SQL. And if we move back to Dataverse within Power Platform, this is the one that we're looking at. And if I refresh, the data gets updated near real time without any data core. The one we just changed that in Azure SQL is available here instantaneously in Dataverse table in Power Platform. This is a Power Apps. It's a gallery with list of details. And when the Power Apps just loaded, the name got updated. So you could not only look to verify by refreshing the table, because as an end user, you wouldn't have access to the backend database. So all you would be seeing is the Power App as an user experience. What I will do make this one little bigger so it's easy to read through. If you wanted to do the other way around, for example, if you wanted to update this data back into SQLs and if you wanted to change some of these items, that's totally fine. And if I click on Charlie Davis, and notice that it's 714.2 cents is the fulfillment status and the price. And if I edit that as an end user, I would make it to, let's say, 77142. And that update is done. Once the app refreshes, you would see that value in here in Power Apps. So it is just refreshing, meaning the connection is taking place and the data is being sent to SQL Server. As you can see, it just took less than a half a second, right? 7714.2. Now, if I come back to SQL, this is the row that we updated, which is 714, which should be 7,714. And if I do a quick refresh, and this value would change, and it has changed. So it kind of opens up a lot of scope for enterprise app where we would need to build an app connecting to the other data sources, but not really cloud your Dataverse with that databases. You could pretty much use the virtual table here and bring those data in here. There are limitations of using a virtual table that would be available at the end of this video where you could take a look at that. All this data is coming from the virtual table, right? We could create a new blank table without any data in there and then use this virtual table column as a primary key as a lookup field as well. For that, we'll go back to the tables, create a new normal ordinary table, meaning not an virtual table. This one is going to be stored within the Dataverse. It's not a virtual table, right? Let's say underscore DB. So it's a Dataverse table. When you have an existing table, like Dataverse table, and if you wanted to have a lookup column with the virtual table, you could easily do that through a lookup column of the primary key. So now if I go to columns and add a new column, and I want to bring in the customer name from the SQL database, I'll just say SQL DB. And the data type, instead of single line of text, I would choose lookup. In here, we would call the table name, which is the virtual SQL table, this one. It would open up the option for us to connect with the virtual table. So you could interact with some of those columns that's in the virtual table along with the Dataverse table. So this is the Dataverse table that we just created. And we created a lookup column here, which is calling from the virtual SQL table, which has the column customer name and other details. So you could bring in the necessary ones based on the primary keys and columns that's available. So that is almost the end of this demo. And there are limitations in terms of bringing in the virtual table onto the Dataverse has some down effects in terms of auditing is impossible or not available right now. And you can't bring in the image column and other complex columns that's available in the virtual table. There's a whole list of it, and which is available in the description where you could go ahead and take a look at that as well. Thank you.